Actually, I quite like the irrelevant parts of it. I wouldn't mind. I like going out on strange, paths which other people haven't.
Hello and welcome to this event, which is coming to you from the Edinburgh International Book Festival at its new home at Edinburgh College of Art. My name's Claire Armitstead. I'm Associate Editor for Culture at The Guardian. And I'm here to talk to, with great pleasure, just a little bit of trepidation, knowing a bit too much about his rapier wit over the years, with Craig Brown, who many of you will have read as a diarist in Private Eye, so well known that almost unheard of for a journalist. He celebrated his 25 years as a journalist for Private Eye with a command performance at the Royal National Theatre, in which he took down some of the most famous people in literature. But he's also the author of biographies. This is his most recent jaunt, and he has, I would say, reinvented the art of biography. Most recently with the 2017 insight into Princess Margaret, which was called Ma'am Darling, 99 glimpses of a princess, which rather slightly bafflingly is down in Wikipedia as being a predominantly factual biography. And maybe we could discuss that. I wondered whether that was you going into your biography and making a joke, Craig. But the subject of this review is 1, 2, 3, 4, which is biography of the Beatles, the band we all love to love, and some of us love to hate, or some of us love to hate some of them and hate other ones of them, which won the Baillie Gifford Prize last year and was described by Martha Carney, the judge the chair with good reason, as a joyous, irreverent, insightful celebration. Not irrelevant, never irrelevant. Craig, welcome.
Thanks. Actually, I quite like the irrelevant parts of it. I wouldn't mind. I like going out on strange, paths which other people haven't gone.
I think that maybe it's because I've been infected by doing too much mugging up on your reviews. Craig, as part of this Baillie Gifford celebration, has written an essay about the art of biography, in which he described a well-known lady novelist as the mistress of untelling detail in her memoir. We won't name her, will we, Craig? For this occasion.
You have to buy the essay to find out who it is.
However, you are the master of the telling detail. Tell us about this biography and why you wanted to write about the Beatles.
Well, I mean, like millions of people around the world, the Beatles have just been, especially my age and a bit older, Beatles have been part of my life since the age of about 7, I suppose, so I was 6 in 1963 when they kind of became big in England. So it's slightly autobiographical, and I deal with that a little bit. But I think almost in retrospect, I can see the reason I wrote it was because it's basically such an amazing story. Because it's not just one person; you get 4, and this is the extraordinary fairy tale of these completely unknown working class Liverpudlians who became, within a matter of years, the foremost famous men in the world.
When you say within a matter of years, we're talking 3 years.
Yeah. Well, I suppose Paul met John in 1957, but they were sort of, Paul was 15 or something like that. But really, it was almost, certainly in America, it was over. You could almost say it was overnight. It was the first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show just so took off. And in Britain, it was from the end of 62 through 63, and then they'd become famous. But then also, so you have that extraordinary story. But then I found everyone they were involved with at all stages, like Brian Epstein, completely fascinating character, Maharishi, these kind of con men who flocked around them like Magic Alex. And also then you have the politicians like Harold Wilson or Edward Heath wanting to be seen with them, or even LBJ in America. And then wider than that, you have Gorbachev and Putin both saying that in their youth that the Beatles were seen as a kind of emblem of freedom in the Soviet Union. And so it's a sort of story that's got everything. And of course, it's been written often enough, but I wanted to kind of convey something a bit different, part of which is just the excitement of it and the humor of it, I think.
As I was reading it, I was thinking about whether there were any equivalents now, that sort of celebrity. Do you think there are, or do you? I mean, there's a sort of total full throttleness about the celebrity that and involving very young people feeling they were rediscovering.
Sorry, I'm losing you on the and you're occasionally freezing, but basically, I think your thing was about could it be repeated? And I'd say it couldn't be repeated because now pop music, especially, is so widespread, and there are so many celebrities. Love Island's just finished, and suddenly those people have become celebrities. It just didn't work like that in the 60s. There weren't very many famous people, and certainly not many famous young people. There was sort of Elvis, and before him Frank Sinatra. But and I think you couldn't repeat it now because it's such a crowded world, and so many people have so many different and peculiar interests. But everyone was listening to the Beatles. I mean, my parents were completely aware of the Beatles. They weren't fans, but I remember them talking about how, She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah. They, like lots of parents, were offended by the yeah, 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 and including Paul McCartney's father, who said, couldn't you change that to yes, yes, yes? And so the whole world knew about the Beatles, and I think you couldn't repeat that now.
Mm. And so, as with Princess Margaret, you're dealing with people whose lives have sort of become mythologized. Even sometimes you wonder to them whether they themselves have any better grasp on what the reality is than anyone else. And in response to this extreme celebrity, you've invented a new sort of biography.
Well, I think it would be terribly odd for the two remaining Beatles, Paul and Ringo, because they're now talking about something that happened 50 years ago. I mean, they broke up 51 years ago now, almost. And which of us can remember what we were doing in our 20s, on any particular day? When Hunter Davis was doing the original authorized biography in about 67, he was interviewing the Beatles, and they couldn't remember how many times they'd been to Hamburg. They didn't know whether it was once, twice, or three times. And that was, a few years after they'd been in Hamburg. And so I suspect that all Paul and Ringo's memories are memories that they're memories of memories. And they're from what they've read as much as from what they actually remember.
Mm.
I mean, obviously they'd have memories of Paul, of say Brian Epstein or George Martin, but they'd have to look to a book to find out what George Martin was doing on a particular day, or that sort of thing. So books are much more particular, I think, than someone's memory.
So one particular incident that you draw on very early on in this book is Paul's 21st birthday party. Will you read for us your account of it in your essay? Because I find it totally fascinating.
Yes, it's just, I'll read a little bit about, the essay is really about the sort of, it's called the slippery art of biography, and saying how it's almost impossible to write an accurate, it is impossible, I'd say, to write an accurate biography. So I'll start with a little bit of sort of theorizing, and then I'll just give this event. In a letter to Arnold Zweig, who had just suggested writing his biography, Sigmund Freud wrote, "Anyone turning biographer commits himself to lies, to concealment, to hypocrisy, to flattery, and even to hiding his own lack of understanding. For biographical truth is not to be had, and even if it were, it couldn't be used." This may be too severe, but the artificiality of the genre is helped neither by the slippery nature of memory, nor indeed by the slippery nature of biographers. Everyone who has ever written non-fiction will know that from paragraph to paragraph, perhaps even from sentence to sentence, one is always obliged to pick which version of the truth to tell. Every available source has a slightly different tale. It would be tedious to present each different version of each event, or the finished book would be impossibly long and impossibly boring. So which to choose? And how do you know if it is the right one? And so I then in the book go on since the time you remembered, you prompted me, which is Paul McCartney's 21st birthday, when the Beatles were just beginning to get famous. I remember they were really excited because they thought that Cliff Richard, who was much more famous than them, might be coming. In fact, he never did turn up. Anyway, in the book, I present a chart of 15 different accounts from both onlookers and historians of John Lennon's...
Some of them are accounts of John Lennon's several accounts, aren't they? Some of the 15, for example.
Sorry, what did you say?
Some of the accounts, it's John Lennon having 3 different memories.
Oh yes, yeah. So his own memories are different. Yeah, and it's it was at Paul McCartney's Auntie Gin's house on 21st of June 1963, and that everyone seems to agree that Wooler, who is this disc jockey, Bob Wooler, he was the Cavern disc jockey, provoked John by teasing him about his recent holiday in Spain with Brian Epstein, and that Bob Wooler had ended up in hospital. But eyewitnesses differ over the nature of the assault and the extent of the injuries. Tony Barrow, who was present, reports simply that John, quotes, punched Wooler. Tony Bramwell, also present, says he assaulted Bob, leaving him with, quote, broken ribs and a bloody nose. Another eyewitness, Peter Brown, these are all people who worked for the Beatles, described it as a pummeling and remembers it taking, quotes, 3 men to pull John off, not before he managed to break 3 of the man's ribs. Cynthia Lennon, John's wife, says John leapt on Bob and gave him a black eye and badly bruised ribs. And to the Beatles' authorized biographer, Hunter Davis said, I broke his bloody ribs for him. John's old school friend, Pete Shotton, his best friend, recalls John, quotes, repeatedly clobbering him in the face with a shovel, adding that, quotes, the damage to Bob's visage was so extensive that an ambulance had to be summoned to rush him to hospital with extensive damage to his face. The Beatles' solicitor, who had to deal with the matter, suggested that Bob Wooler had made a pass at John and that in return, John gave Wooler a black eye and a broken nose. So I go through all these different ones. You know, Ray Connolly, another biographer, gives John a stick to beat Wooler. Bob Spitz says that John leapt on Wooler, beating him viciously with tightly closed fists. And then the most unforgiving of John's biographers, Albert Goodman, also seems to have direct access to John's thoughts at the time. He said he's seizing a shovel that was lying in the yard. Lennon began to beat Wooler to death. Blow after blow came smashing down on the defenseless man lying on the ground. It would have ended in murder if John had not suddenly realized, if I hit him one more time, I'll kill him. Making an enormous effort of will, Lennon restrained himself. And that just comes from nowhere. I then say, no other episode in the lives of the Beatles illustrates quite so starkly the random, subjective nature of history, a form predicated on objectivity, but reliant on the shifting sands of memory. As Paul McCartney himself once said, in an earthquake, you get many different versions of what happened by all the people that saw it, and they're all true. So that's a kind of interesting area.
So there's an extent to which this is a biography of biography, in that you're sort of examining in very minute, close detail the way in which things are recreated by the Beatles' biographies.
Yes, it's very interesting. I mean, I think it's almost unavoidable. I mean, I'm particularly interested in it, but I think it's unavoidable to, if you're writing an honest book, not to, at least from time to time, show how random every selection of facts must be, because you can't. I mean, say I was writing a book about the Beatles, and I thought, well, I must treat every story in that way by quoting every different source and all the different interpretations. You know, the book would be unimaginably long and unimaginably boring. And so you do have to select these things, but it's an artificial selection. I mean, when I've done it, I've gone with, and same with my biography of Princess Margaret, which is my previous book, I've tried to go for the most likely version rather than the most, exaggerated or interesting version. But how, you can't actually tell what's the most likely version. It's a fascinating area, really.
So you quote, in the essay again, you quote Peter Ackroyd as saying, fiction requires truth-telling, whereas in biography, one can make things up. Now, you would deny, I mean, you're trying to not make things up. Is that right?
I think he's being probably overly paradoxical and sort of playful. But I think there is a basic thing that everyone knows, that fiction is fiction, and they take it from there. I mean, sometimes you get pedants who want to know who, the real Dorothea is in Middlemarch or whatever. But you know that you're reading a story, a made-up story. With biography, you don't think that. You think you're reading the real thing, and yet it is, however assiduous and honest the biographer, it is to some extent made up, because you're cutting out dull weeks, or you're cutting out stuff you can never find out. You're cutting out all the thoughts of people, unless you're completely...
Well, you don't. Some biographers don't, as you so clearly reveal.
Like that one with Albert Goldman, who actually says, John's thought, if I hit him one more time, I'll kill him. Well, how could he possibly know that John was thinking that while he was punching him? And he might, if John had ever given an interview, which he didn't, where he said, actually, I thought at the time, if I hit him, I'll kill him. Well, I suppose he'd be justified in putting it in. But even then, would it necessarily be true that John's memory of what he thought was what he thought? You know what I mean? So
it's not the sort of thing you think in a Red Mist necessarily, is it?
And I think everyone, and in a way, people are attracted to biography and history because it simplifies life. In a way that's not the attraction of fiction. Good fiction shows life in all its complications, and I think biography isn't. It's a dodgy genre, I think.
So we've talked a bit about that, the way you presented that particular party as a table of what was supposed to have happened, the table has, and then what the injury was supposed to have been, the outcome of it. It's tabulated. But you also play other narrative tricks. For example, the what if of Paul McCartney failing or passing his GCSE Latin.
Yeah, I think that it is fascinating. I mean, one of the great things about the Beatles is, these four people who obviously needed each other and to create this amazing music, and the likelihood in the world of these four people meeting was very, very small. And an example of that is the one you mentioned, which is that Paul at his school. Paul was a year older than George, and at his school he failed his Latin GCSE and so couldn't go up a year. And because of that, and he only failed it by a margin. Because of that, he was in the same year as George, and so he met George for the first time. And because of that, George became a Beatle. So and it's completely true that if Paul had done better in Latin, if he'd worked harder at his Latin, George wouldn't have been a Beatle. George would have presumably been like George's brothers, who were just normal working people.
And Paul would have, almost ended up going, doing what his father wanted him to do, which was to earn a decent wage. And
yes, there was a bit when George came back from Hamburg after the second time, and basically they'd been sort of chucked out of Hamburg. It all seemed a flop. Paul's father, as I'm a father, I'd say sensibly, was trying to get him to do a job. Paul was very good, personable. He'd have risen in any company, so he did get just a normal job. And it was John who kind of persuaded him, cajoled him into rejoining the Beatles at the Cavern one day. But without that push, he might well have just stopped in music. So everything is very random, but I don't think that by showing the randomness that I'm undermining the Beatles. I hope I'm not.
No, not at all. It becomes part of this sort of extraordinary, the sort of tensile strength of a biography is precisely how it relates to randomness, isn't it? It is random and yet it isn't random. Now, there's a much bigger story to this, which is the historical backstory, which actually, without which they would not have existed, which was the period just coming out of the First World War, when there was a huge, great youth movement, and even the serendipity of them arriving in America on the Ed Sullivan Show 11 weeks after the assassination of President Kennedy.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, with America, it was interesting. I mean, it shows what a necessary part of the Beatles story Brian Epstein was, because he'd seen that Cliff Richard had tried to break in America. But he was unknown in America and it hadn't worked. So Brian Epstein decided that only when the Beatles got a #1 hit would they go to America. So they'd always have to have a sort of following before. And then he fixed with Ed Sullivan very cleverly that they'd do it for virtually nothing, but they'd have 2 shows and that they'd be the headliners. And so he set it all up. And sorry, I can't remember how the randomness. You were
the randomness of them arriving. Would they have been such a big hit? I mean,
yes, about 10.
Yes.
No, they wouldn't. I mean, yeah, they wouldn't. Obviously, I don't think Brian Epstein would have been able to see any connection between their arrival a few months after, or 11 weeks after Kennedy's assassination. But I think, in retrospect, people can see that after November, when he was assassinated, there was a kind of gloom had descended over America. And then when they came in, I think February of the next year, they were suddenly, America needed this release. And so I think, for instance, the singing nun, who my parents had her single, Dominica Nika Nika, was #1 in America. So, and that's almost, so in a way, that was a kind of religious thing people were looking to, and of course Kennedy was Catholic, and so they supplanted the singing nun in the charts. And I think there is, I mean, I'm always a bit wary of zeitgeisty things, but I think that is an emblem of the zeitgeist, and that a lot of clever American writers have said that this was an amazing feeling of release, and that America could start to sort of smile again. Because another thing about the Beatles is they were very funny, and all those you can see their press conferences on YouTube, and they're just so sort of bursting with joy in their own luck, and sort of cheekiness, and not minding. They're not, the extraordinary thing about them is, even though they were so young, they were completely uncowed by anything. And so getting off the plane, going into a room full of 200 hard-nosed American pressing just didn't bother them. Didn't bother them at all.
You have a very interesting section on their humour, and on where you talk about the goons and punning. And yes. John was a huge punner, and I talk a little bit about that sort of particular form of humour, which is, I'm married to a Scouser, and his older brothers, who are that sort of closer to that generation, they absolutely have this weird punning humour, which I've never really understood.
Yeah, well, John, if you see his sort of childhood, he wrote. He was always a big writer. He was always, though he was in some ways lazy by nature, he always wrote long letters back to fans and things. Anyway, when he was at school, he started a kind of comic just for himself, and he loved sort of Lewis Carroll, Edward Lear, and then later the Goons, and he loved puns. And I think, puns are very interesting, just as part of someone's mind. And Spike Milligan obviously was a very tortured person, and the Goons are entirely puns, really. And so I have quite a long involved chapter just about puns. And when you said irrelevant rather than irreverent, that's a kind of thing I like about my book, the irrelevant, seemingly irrelevant things. To have, say, 6 pages on the nature of puns in the middle of a book about the Beatles could be seen as irrelevant by someone who simply wanted to know about the facts of the Beatles. But and of course, then it goes on with John, that when Stephen Baillie, who's now a kind of famous sort of design guru, but he was a child at John's old school, aged 14 or 15. He wrote a letter to John in '66 saying how his old English teacher was now teaching the lyrics of the Beatles, so John's lyrics. And John thought this was so funny that he wrote "I Am the Walrus," which with nonsense lyrics, with puns and meaningless, it was like the Jabberwocky or something. But he wanted to make it as absurd as possible, just with the idea that this would be taught in his own school. So he used those puns as a way of rebellion, as well as a reflection of the various muddles in his own mind.
And of course, there came a stage when everybody wanted a bit of them. So you have a lovely story about him being presented with an award by Harold Wilson, who wanted to get the youth vote, basically, and then totally upending the occasion by sort of taking the mickey out of him. And you do that you present that as dialogue, which presumably is on the record.
Yes, I think you can see that on YouTube. YouTube's a marvelous kind of feast of stuff on the Beatles, but you can see this old-fashioned variety club event, I think, where they're presenting him with an award. And you can also see how eager, because it was just before the '64 election, I suppose, how eager Harold Wilson is to sort of be chummy with the Beatles, and also to show that he knows what each one is called. So he says, "Paul, why don't you come to the microphone?" and that kind of thing. And I think it is a kind of pivotal moment where politicians suddenly are bowing to showbiz. I mean, it's completely normal now, but it wasn't then. But the politician are genuflecting to the showbiz people rather than the other way around. And I think it was the Beatles who did that. And they also, I actually have them in the Princess Margaret book. They did the same with Princess Margaret, in that Princess Margaret was at the party after, I think it was Help or Hard Day's Night. And George was very hungry. George, 18 or something, was very hungry and wanted to start eating, and he was told, "Well, you can't start eating until the royalty has left," because Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon were due to leave. And so he actually just went up to Princess Margaret and said, "I'm really hungry. When are you going to leave?" And she said, "Oh yes, I'm so sorry," and sort of bustled away. And so suddenly, there was a change of tide in the state of Britain, and yeah, from then on, royalty had to chase pop stars rather than the other way around.
So we've talked about the positive side, well, that they're them taking the world by storm, but there's a really dark side of this, which went as far as Charles Manson sort of claiming he was inspired by the White Album. But it also must have been extraordinary for them. They were having people people cutting off pieces of their hair as they tried to get into a car. I mean,
no, well, actually worse. It was at the there was a reception at the Washington embassy, the British embassy in Washington, for them. But it was the worst kind of snobbery of Britain at the time, Britain transposed to America, where all these people just sort of treated them as if they were performing animals in a way, very kind of rude to them. And yes, someone actually not part of that sort of snobbish apparatus. She was a fan who'd managed to sneak in, but she just went up to Ringo while he was talking to someone and just with a pair of scissors and snipped off his hair. And so I think it must have been, in some way, it was a sort of, there were certainly very frightening incidents for them. I mean, with the Marcoses in Manila, they were sort of almost beaten up by the Marcoses people because they hadn't come to the right reception, and so there were penalties and are penalties for being that famous, and then the people who like you were saying, Charles Manson, who sort of misinterpret your lyrics as weird calls to murder, and Charles Manson, the word helter-skelter isn't part of the American vocabulary. They don't know. We all know what a helter-skelter is, but Manson didn't know what it was and interpreted it as a sort of call to murder. And so there were dark times, the Beatles.
I mean, that's a very extreme example, but in a way, it's not. So, then you have the whole mystique of what the Abbey Road album cover stood for. Did it mean Paul was dead? No, so people were sort of real. There was a lot of real sort of dark stuff going on around them.
Yes, and I think you can see. I have a bit towards the end of the book. I have a photograph of them, in 1963, and another photograph of them in say 69. I can't remember the exact date. But they did seem to age unbelievably. I mean, it was a time when suddenly you grew your hair, you grew beards, so lots of people were aging in a slightly similar way. But I think they did in some way take on the sort of burden of the world without knowing it. And you can see, and they somehow lost, though I think their music became more interesting and various. They lost that initial sense of fun and enjoyment of each other. So it sort of went a bit sour, yeah.
Mm. Now, you put yourself into this book in a couple of places, in a couple of significant ways, which is unusual for you, from my reading. And one of which is that there's a very clear picture of you as a little boy at a prep school, a Catholic prep school, being, getting drawn into them and drawn into the wordplay and how it connected with the religious songs that you were being taught.
Oh, yes, yeah. I do. I put myself in, I hope reasonably sparingly, but yes, I was at a Catholic prep school from the age of 7, and we were singing these Latin, most of the hymns were Latin in those days, and there's this one called Tantum Ergo Sacramento. I won't do the whole hymn. Anyway, but of course no one really knew what it meant. And at the same time, I was getting, Sergeant Pepper was out, and then later the Double White, and there are all these equally mysterious lyrics. To say happiness is a warm gun or something, I wouldn't have been able to interpret every part of that meaning. And so I compare this, or Lady Madonna, because it was a Catholic prep school. I thought, oh, well, this is a sort of sign of their religious beliefs. And I think everyone has their own interpretations of the Beatles songs. And I think I say in the book, when you talk about the Beatles, you talk about yourself. Everyone always wants to know, it was almost as current today as it was then, but you talk about the Beatles, who's your favorite Beatle? And then the fact which Beatle you choose, it's like saying your star sign. It seems to say something about you. And of course it does say something about you.
And which one did you choose?
I think I've always liked Paul best. And I particularly believe that when there was a time after John was murdered, where you can see why it happened, but people were saying, well, he was the great genius, Paul was simply the showman. And I think, and people almost attacked Paul for the very fact of being alive. And I felt that was unfair. I think that's been corrected more recently. People are beginning to appreciate what a kind of a brilliant melodic master he was. But also, I think his lyrics. I mean, those days, things like Eleanor Rigby or She's Leaving Home. He was about 25 when he wrote those. They're very sophisticated. And also another thing with both John and Paul, they got out of this thing of only writing songs about yourself. So it wasn't just I love you. They'd do Eleanor Rigby or Father Mackenzie. They'd make these little little short stories, I suppose. And that was quite new. The Kinks did it a little bit later, but I think you could say they started it.
Going more into the songs. So you pick out 2 particular songs that you talk about, and one is She Loves You, and the other is Hey Jude. And yes. I wondered why you picked those songs out and what they mean particularly.
Well, I wanted to concentrate on some songs because, as I was saying, you have to be selective. And I wanted, Hey Jude sort of meant the most to me, and it sort of followed me round. And there were just lots of interesting stories around it. I mean, there's actually I had a friend who died a year or two ago. I used to play golf with, called Neil Innes of the Bonzo Dog Band, but he remembered Paul playing it to him for the first time, just saying, "What do you think of this?" Paul had produced a Bonzo Dog single. What do you think of that? And Neil thought, "Oh, it goes on a bit long, you know," and all that kind of thing. And there is something mysterious about the power of Hey Jude, and it's partly to do with the length, and partly to do. It's just a very reassuring song. John Updike said it was like the sun coming out on Easter morning, and I think there is something special about it. So I wanted to concentrate on that, and then She Loves You. Slightly for the reason I was saying, but you know, my parents and other people objecting to it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was the one song, the first of the Beatles song where everyone knew it. You know, you could see it in headlines, and it had just kind of caught on. And it's so simple. And so I go into how it was composed and the effect on the world, and people hearing it for the first time and then wanting to start their own group and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. You're very generous towards Ringo. You really like Ringo, don't you? I mean, I think Ringo comes out of this book very well, and he's so often dismissed.
Yes, well, I like him because he's a sort of Dr. Watson figure. You know, the other Beatles are Sherlock Holmes in their different ways. You know, they're slightly, you know, they're probably more intelligent, more creative, more hidden. You know, their characters are more obscure. And Ringo, who was, you know, it's important to remember, he was more within the Liverpool scene. He was more famous than the Beatles when they sacked Pete Best and took him on, and that he was a real catch for the Beatles. He was seen as a very good drummer, and I think people are beginning to recognise what a good drummer he was. But also, I liked him just as in the terms of telling a story. That he was the sort of foil for the others. He, in a way, well, I was going to say he was like Ernie Wise to Morecambe, but in some ways he was the funny one, and he was the one who was the least deceived by passing events, as sometimes the thicker people are. You know, he was less caught up in the hippie world. He was less transfixed by people like Magic Alex or the Maharishi. Yeah, so he was in a way he was the kind of Shakespearean voice of the common man, kind of.
But he was sort of knowing about it. Just going back to that event, that Variety Club event with Harold Wilson, he says, anyone who knows us says I'm the one who never speaks. So I'd just like to say thanks a lot. And the other two are riffing about silver hearts and purple hearts.
Yes, I didn't know that he was known as the one who didn't speak, but I think he was silent. He was certainly silent in the studio because he had the least creative juices, and he was just the drummer, so he would just sit there, often reading comics. There's another reason I wanted to say that I liked Ringo. He was incredibly ill. First, he was easily the poorest, came from the poorest background, one-parent family, the only one with an outside toilet in the poorest part. And then he had been in hospital for about 2 years of his childhood, often kind of close to death. His mother was told to prepare, you know, that he was going to die. And so, and he couldn't really, you know, he hadn't really been taught to read and write. And so he had the biggest kind of journey, to use the sort of current expression. And so there's something very touching about his story, I think.
Mm. Now, the person that you write, it seems to me, most on, you lean heaviest on, and you also are, in a way, sternest about, is John Lennon,
Yeah.
And I wondered why that was, whether that's because there is more on the record about him, or whether that's because of how you feel about him.
Well,
because he's dead, and you can't talk about Paul McCartney.
Not because he's. I certainly hope it's not that reason, but there is an amazing amount of information you can get on all of the Beatles, and including John. I don't at all deny his genius or his, you say which of your Beatles is your favourite, but you know, Paul McCartney without Lennon, or Lennon without McCartney, the Beatles wouldn't have been anything like the same thing. None of they did so many songs together, all those early songs. So I don't disregard his genius. But I'm afraid that there just isn't amazing. If you read Cynthia Lennon's biographies, or even Pete Shotton, his best friend, or, there are just terrible stories, which a lot of which I didn't put in the book because I didn't want to kind of come down. It wasn't meant to kind of trash John. And obviously you do things age 22, which you'd never dream of doing age 39. But I mean, terrible tales of anti-Semitism, sort of really creepy dislike of disabled people, that sort of thing. And I put a few in, but people have filled books with those things, and most of them are completely verifiable. So I think he had a very bitter side to him. I mean, he'd also there were 2 or 3 accounts of him beating women up. But I think you have to put them in, but also you have to say, okay, he was young. You've got to forgive people. But in that way, he's easily the most complicated of the Beatles. But it's silly just to say, oh, because he wrote these great songs, you must see him as a sort of as a human being without flaws.
Mm. And then that brings us on to the why question, the Yoko question. And she seems to have been, over the last few years, she's been largely rehabilitated. People have been reassessing her and saying, oh yeah, she was a great artist in her own right. But you don't think that, do you? Or that doesn't come out of this, this book?
I don't think that, because first I'm not, I'm very interested in art, but I have very scant interest in conceptual art. Well, I have an interest in it, but I have no love for it. And I think even if you do like conceptual art, she's not the pioneer that people often pretend she is. You can see a lot of plagiarism going on in those early pieces. I mean, all her pieces. And I mean, well, the early pieces, and then everything else she's done has just been a repetition of what she was doing in 1966. People appreciate her more now because she's old and she's, survived this widowhood, and she had this terrible thing happen to John. But I think she was a bad influence to a large extent because he had a facility for self-pity, which I think she fueled or encouraged, and his songs became sort of maudlin and self-pitying and also sort of egotistical. I mean, I quite like Ballad of John and Yoko, but it isn't absurd if you read the lyrics, saying they're going to crucify me, or even Working Class Hero. The other Beatles thought that he was the middle class one. I mean, he was compared to those. And so I think her influence was, so I did think, well, I mean, I could have just left her out of the book anyway. And then I was thinking, well, perhaps I should do it, on the one hand, on the other. And then I thought, no, the whole point of writing a book is to say what you think, regardless of whether it's, that she now has a kind of fan club. And so I just tried to make it funny and put in, I mean, I think it is a funny chapter, but it is certainly in America, it's the one that has raised most eyebrows. I mean, people feel fondly towards her, and well, they can, but it's always, I'm all for people enjoying or reading another point of view. So I think people thought I was sort of old-fashioned and out of step with the times, which maybe I am, but I sort of feel that in another 50 years, everyone will remember John Lennon, but she'll be a sort of, she'll be a footnote.
She'll be one of the minor characters like poor old Pete Shotton. Now, just before I open it to questions, please do start asking questions, because you will all probably have your own Beatles questions you're desperate to put to Craig. I just wanted to ask you one last question about Brian Epstein. And he's the sort of the underlying tragic figure, and you choose to end the biography with a sort of back to front chronology,
yes,
which centres Brian Epstein.
Yes, I take it from his death. I find it actually hard to write because I'm not very mathematical, or to write something backwards is quite hard. So I take it, it's in a way that I think it's the largest chapter in the book, but it starts with his death. So death, and then goes backwards to his funeral. Is that going backwards? Anyway, and then it ends, the book ends with, as the book begins, which is him going down the stairs of the cavern for the first time and finding the Beatles. Because I think him finding the Beatles was both his salvation and his damnation. That if he hadn't discovered the Beatles, he wouldn't have had all these pressures, and he might have just sort of survived, just being in a prosperous Liverpool family, and might have. But he always seemed like the kind of straight, normal one who could manage everything, but actually he was taking far more drugs than the Beatles were, and he was far more out of control. And so I did the thing in reverse, and I think I wasn't quite sure why I did it. I think you should do some things instinctively, but I think
it works very well because because it sort of it shakes up your idea of one's idea of his importance to them, because it really did fall apart after he died. Now, whether it was heading that way anyway or not, it's quite shocking when you're confronted with the chronology of it.
Yes, I think, I mean, they'd stopped touring. Brian Epstein had, with them having stopped touring, his role was greatly diminished because he was a master of kind of, just getting them around and booking the right venues and knowing what to charge and all that kind of thing. He hardly ever went into the studio. He didn't take hadn't any say in the musical side of it. So I think he was being marginalized. And they were progressing. I mean, they did great stuff after he died. So, almost all my favorite Beatles stuff is actually after he died. But they lacked that kind of cohesiveness, and they started getting irritated by themselves. I think he could have kept it going for another year or two. I mean, also their final fallout was really about, it always is with groups, it was about money. And Alan Klein taking over. The other three Beatles wanted Alan Klein to take over, and Paul wanted his father-in-law, Linda's father, and so obviously they wouldn't have had that if Brian Epstein had still been in charge. They wouldn't have had that to argue about, and they might have gone on for a bit longer.
Right, so I'm going to now open it out for questions. We've got them coming in. First question from David R. is: has any biographer influenced your own approach to biography?
Well, I think everything you read influences you in some way. I mean, even the bad stuff makes you think, oh, it mustn't be that bad. I love kind of playful, all playful biographers like Lytton Strachey, I think is great, or Jeff Dyer's book about D.H. Lawrence. I mean, it's not really a book about D.H. Lawrence, but it's very, very funny. I like. There's a great book called The Quest for Corvo, which is about this sort of slightly down and out writer's figure, and that's treated like a detective story. I like Alethea Hayter. I don't know if you read A Sultry Summer or Sultry Month, but that just focuses on one month in British kind of literary, arty history in London. I like those ones with books which have a particular focus and then a playful, rather than and I've read hundreds of them, the ones like the recent controversial book about Philip Roth, which are good. There are a whole lot which are good, solid slogs through someone's life, and they start out with a great grandparents coming from Ireland or whatever, and then they go through to the funeral and I. Though I sort of read them with some enjoyment, they're not the kind of books I want to do. I don't want to do a sort of glorified CV of the person. I want something sort of trickier or trixier. Yeah.
Linked again on the subject of biography, from Andrew T. says, instead of the biographer attempting the definitive life of, is it better, as Sarah Churchwell does in her recent biography of Marilyn Monroe, to focus on exploring the lingering controversies which surround the subject?
Actually, I read that biography. It's not that, it's about 10 years old, I think. I mean, I didn't think she did it very well. I could see what she was trying to do, but I thought her prose is too laborious. Yeah, I mean, I think with someone like Marilyn, it's obviously the interesting thing is the memory of Marilyn and the theories about her death, or rather than, you know, her as an actual person. And that probably applies to lots of showbiz figures, that the interest is in what you can see rather than the life behind, which might be quite sort of vapid. I suppose you could say that everyone you choose has to be done in the best way for them, and the best way for half people isn't the sort of the cradle to grave biography. It's just getting the most interesting week of their lives and just writing about that, for instance. I mean, a much better book I thought about Marilyn Monroe was Alan Clark's brother, Alan Clark, the MP, his brother Colin Clark wrote a book called My Week with Marilyn, which was just, he met Marilyn for a week when he was a schoolboy at Eton, I think, or just after he'd left Eton. And you get a much more vivid picture of her, just concentrating on that week that a schoolboy spent with her. And I think that applies to I find a lot of kiss and tell books fascinating, or ghosted showbiz memoirs. They can be as fascinating as any kind of great academic book on it.
You're a fan of Alan Clark's, aren't you? That old rogue.
I like Alan. I even like, you know, Katie Price's biographies. I don't imagine you've read them, but they're completely fascinating because they're completely unguarded. You know, she actually doesn't read them, let alone write them. She just, you know, talks with someone. But they give a very, I can't remember what her name was, the girl on Big Brother who then later died of cancer.
Oh, Jade.
Yeah, Jade Goody. Her ghostwritten autobiography is amazing. It reads like it's a sort of Dickensian childhood. She was having to inject her mother with heroin, age 6, and things. I mean, and this was all in the, I suppose, early 80s. And so there's a lot. I think, you know, there are a lot of interesting books beyond the books which would, you know, be reviewed in the serious newspapers.
Mm. It brings us to another question from Doug, which is, in preparing to write your book, did you feel obliged to plough through the scores of books written by so many people who had something to do with the Beatles, even in the most minor way?
Well, weirdly, the word isn't obliged. I leapt at it. The more I did, unlike Princess Margaret, my previous subject, the more I learned about the Beatles, the more I wanted to learn. And so I was, you know, some of them there's a very high standard of Beatles books. I mean, but particularly among the people who knew them. Virtually everyone who worked for them has written a biography, or the recording engineer, George Martin, you know, the press officers, and Cynthia's written too. Pete Shotton, the school friend I mentioned earlier, his book's extremely good. That's a ghost-written book, but you get the feeling it's completely authentic, that his memories are authentic.
Have you ever done ghostwriting?
No, I was once, years and years ago, maybe 30 years ago, I was taken up by someone at Virgin Books who I knew slightly, and he said, "So what do you think of Phil Collins?" And I said, well, sort of indifferent, really. I don't really hate him or love him. He said, "That's just the person we want." And his idea was someone that if you have a real fan ghostwriting a book, their fanhood is just going to get in the way. And obviously, if they hate the person, they're not going to get on with them. So you want someone who's indifferent and will just do it as a job of journalism. I did actually, you know, I did semi-sign up to it, but Phil Collins didn't want to. I never even met Phil Collins, and he didn't want to do it. I think he did do one eventually about 2 years ago. But that's I mean, I think it would be I haven't got that many years. I'm now 64, so I think I wouldn't embark on that now because there are other things I should be doing. But I'd like to have done one.
A question from Dee. Having written this book, do you think Beatlemania, while an explosion of popularity and success, was the first example of the public's fixation of today's phenomenon, celebrity culture?
Well, it was certainly the largest ever. There had been other ones. I mean, Elvis and Frank Sinatra they both had screaming fans and sort of fanzines and that kind of thing. But it was, I mean, the one area that Brian Epstein wasn't good, and you can't really blame him, was the sort of merchandising. He virtually gave it away because there hadn't been merchandising before that. But then suddenly they were selling, 50,000 Beatles wigs in New York alone on a single day, and that kind of, and someone else was making all the money. But he neglected it because it was unprecedented. And so I think, it was easily the biggest eruption of celebrity culture. And there were, Beatles jigsaws. There were far more. The most recent people, I suppose Michael Jackson had a sort of, you could compare his, but there was still a very limited variety of fans for Michael Jackson. It was, particularly in one particular age group, and lots of people. I think my mother would have been slightly aware of Michael Jackson, but she wouldn't have known anything about him or be able to say any of his songs. Whereas anyone of my parents' generation would have known a number of Beatles songs and would be able to sing them.
And picking up on that thing about Brian Epstein giving away merchandising and the merchandising around them, the story of the lock of John Lennon's hair from 1964, that is such a great story. Do tell that.
Oh well, actually, can I can't remember are you thinking of the tooth?
The hair, the 4-inch lock of hair, which was bought for $35,000 by somebody in Bristol, who everybody thought was.
Yeah, and it is real. You can actually buy it, still on offer. Yeah, so he bought a lock of hair for this vast sum of money, but then what he does is sell each strand of the hair
for $395.
Yeah, and you get it in a little kind of framed thing. But there's also a story, and I have a photo of the tooth. This doctor called Dr. Zook in Canada bought an old tooth, rotten old tooth that John had to have extracted, and John had given it to his housekeeper's daughter, who was a Beatles fan. Anyway, it came up for auction 10 years ago, and Dr. Zook bought it for, I think, £17,000. This grotty little tooth. And then it emerged later that Dr. Zook, his plan was, he said he was just going to take it around dental conferences and things like that. But his plan actually was to extract the DNA and then find out if John had any illegitimate children. They could both, sue the Lennon Ono estate for the money. But that never happened. Anyway, so there are lots of things you can do with Beatles memorabilia.
With Beatles memorabilia. So finally, the final question, and this is a question from Deirdre, and thank you, Deirdre, for asking the question that we all have probably been bursting to ask. Have you ever met any of them? And Deirdre says particularly Ringo or Paul.
No, obviously. It's so pathetic, my connection, that I was very keen when I was about 16, 17 on a group called Grimm's, which actually had my friend I mentioned, Neil Innes, in it, and the other Bonzo Dogs. And it had one of the members was Mike McGear, who's Paul McCartney's brother, who was a singer. They were like a kind of variety troupe. They were very kind of mesmerizing. Anyway, once I went, this is such a long build-up and it's such a boring story, but once I went to the Victoria Palace Theatre, I think, to see Grimm's, and I was sort of early into the audience, and just along the road from me was Paul and Linda were sitting. So this was in the early 70s. And so I'd gone to see Roxy Music the night before, so I had their autographs on a photograph of Roxy Music. And so and that was the only thing I had to sign. So I asked Paul if he could sign this photograph of Roxy Music. And so I've lost it, but I remember he wrote, "And me too, Paul," or Paul McCartney. And so that was my only meeting with Paul. I haven't even though I live quite near his office or even quite near his home, I've never seen him in the street even, and most people have. But
you
I
haven't
wouldn't
had any intimation that he's read it, have you, from anyone?
No, oddly enough, I was doing a Zoom literary conference, and one of the listeners came on and said that he was a pilot on a British Airways flight to New York just a few months ago, and Paul was there, and so he'd gone to speak to Paul, and this nice man, the pilot, had just read my book and loved it, and so he was saying to Paul, "Have you read it?" And Paul said that he hadn't read it, but he said that he would. But I don't suppose he will. But
nice
yeah. And I didn't want to. I mean, I didn't really want to interview him or anything because I mean, not that he might not have wanted to be interviewed, but I didn't want to sort of feel his breath on my shoulder kind of thing. I didn't, I wanted to do it as I wanted to do it rather than in order to please Paul. And I think anyone, whenever I've met a hero, all you want to do is please them, isn't it?
I think, and at that point, with Craig Brown in a rare moment of possible putative hero worship, we're going to have to leave it. I'll just leave with one quote from the essay, which is, "Posterity has no means of verification, so opts instead for style, preferring the good writer to the bad one," which you wrote about the difference between reading Alan Clark and Edwina Currie.
Yes.
And I think that we have a good stylist here, and I hope you will all rush out and buy it. The place to get it from is shop.edinburghbookfest.co.uk. Thank you very much for being in the audience, and thank you, Craig. It's always a delight to talk to you, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.